statecraft. I'm going to pause here for a moment to let the room fill up with folks who have registered for this discussion. Okay. Arnold, Carolyn, we have over 100 people who have tuned in. Vietnam War must still be of some interest. Right. All right. So welcome to everybody to this webinar. Our subject is the 50th anniversary of the Paris Peace Accords, which I actually remember. So does Arnold. We're the senior citizens, I think, in this group. And we've got two distinguished scholars and experts on this matter of the Vietnam War to lead us in our discussion. First of all is Arnold Isaacs. Arnold is a journalist, educator, spent much of his career working for the Baltimore Sun, was indeed the Sun's correspondent in Vietnam during the final 3 years of the war, 1972 to 1975. Out of his reporting came two important books, Vietnam Shadows, The War, Its Ghost, and the first one was Without Honor, Defeat in Vietnam and Cambodia, and then Vietnam Shadows, The War, Its Ghost, and Its Legacies. Without Honor, if I understand it, Arnold, has now just come out in a new and expanded edition. So we welcome you. Our other guest is my friend Carolyn Eisenberg, professor of history at Hofstra University, distinguished scholar, author of the book Drawing the Line, The American Decision to Divide Germany, 1944-1949, a prize winner, won the Stuart Bernath Book Prize and also the Herbert Hoover Book Prize. But of greater relevance to this event, she is the author of a new book, which I will hold up, and I hope people can see it, called Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Wars in Southeast Asia, based on vast archival research to include the use of newly classified documents. It is, I have read this, it is a magnificent history, and I highly recommend it. Now, let us get down to work. And that is my job is to pose a set of questions that will try to stimulate a discussion between our two distinguished guests. We will have, in the latter part of the hour we're going to spend together, an opportunity for those of you who are tuning in to pose your own questions for Carolyn and Arnold. But let's get into it. My first question, the jump ball, as it were, or the puck drop. The Vietnam peace talks went on for years. Why did it take so long to reach an agreement? And what finally broke the logjam so an agreement could be reached? And I'll toss that to you, Arnold. Let us know what you think, and then perhaps we'll have Carolyn chime in on the same question.
The reason the talks began, as you know, in 1968, there were actually two different talks, right? There were the publicly known, announced peace talks between official delegations. And then after President Nixon took office and Henry Kissinger became National Security Advisor, he initiated, I think it was 1969 sometime, private meetings with the North Vietnamese negotiators that went on in secret for quite a long time. Nobody even knew they were happening. The reason that, and then nothing happened, there was no agreement reached until late 1972. And the reason that no agreement was reached was that for all that time, each side had an absolutely non-negotiable position that was non-negotiable from the other opposing side either. The North Vietnamese insisted that before any peace agreement could take effect, that we had to remove Thieu from office and dismantle the South Vietnamese government.
Arnold, remind us who Thieu was.
President Thieu of South Vietnam. And that he would be taken out of office and his government dissolved and the armed forces disbanded. And then they would conclude a peace agreement. And that, of course, was completely out of the question as far as the United States was concerned. And on the other side, President Thieu and the US insisted for many, many years that North Vietnamese troops, who we regarded as foreign aggressors, the Vietnamese position was that Vietnam was a unified country, illegally divided, and so they were not from North Vietnamese, were not foreigners in South Vietnam. But we demanded that the North Vietnamese troops be withdrawn, which Hanoi was not going to do. And those demands remained on the table. As I say, there was no compromise, no possibility that that was going to happen until 1972. In the spring of 1972, the North Vietnamese mounted a major, largely conventional war offensive in South Vietnam, which both sides suffered unprecedented casualties, and neither side really achieved the final objective that it wanted. The North Vietnamese fell way short of what they hoped to achieve in that offensive. They occupied one province capital for a few months and then lost it back. They didn't take any of the other sort of significant population centers that they thought they were going to be able to do. And they lost a huge amount of armored vehicles and artillery, sort of modern weaponry that they had been supplied with the Russians, who were not happy about the performance. So their goals had seemed farther away as the offensive reached its later stages. And the South Vietnamese, at the same time, they had, meanwhile, Nixon had withdrawn almost all of the 500,000 troops that were there, the US troops that were there. And the South Vietnamese could see that was coming, that the end of American support was not going to last forever. So both sides dropped those non-negotiable demands. The North Vietnamese agreed to an agreement without getting rid of the South Vietnamese government, and the US stopped demanding and agreed to the North Vietnamese troops remaining in the South. And once those two concessions had been made, then the rest of the agreement was fairly quickly adopted and agreed to. And I'll add, most people don't remember this, and a lot of the official histories and even scholarly histories don't make a point about it. But in October, the two sides reached a final agreement, a final draft. Every last word was agreed to by both sides, and the US and President Nixon and North Vietnam's Premier Pham Van Dong agreed on a firm date for signing it. Then Thieu objected, and the signing didn't go. We backed out, and the signing didn't go through. But that's the story about what broke the logjam.
So we want to let Carolyn weigh in here, but just a point of emphasis, Arnold, in your description of the spring 1972 offensive, the North Vietnamese failed in their objectives, but to emphasize, when that offensive ended, a very substantial number of North Vietnamese troops were occupying territory in South Vietnam. I think the numbers were something like 140,000. So strategically, the North Vietnamese offensive failed, but when the offensive was over, North Vietnam found itself militarily in a substantially advantageous position. Simply for clarification, Carolyn, I can see you're anxious to weigh in.
Yeah, well, right. So I'm the historian here and the nitpicker. And I think I should warn everybody. Arnold and I have appeared together a couple of other times, and our reality is completely different in the respect that he was there, which gives him a certain authority, and saw lots of what was happening. And I have inhabited the world of classified documents, which I guess everybody now knows there's thousands of those all over the place. So we are coming from a different way. So I want to just do a quick nitpick, but then talk about the larger thing. And the quick nitpick is really that I don't think it's simply, well, each side was immovable and then somehow it changed. Basically, the United States government, the Nixon administration, had really decided by about October of 1970 to stop insisting on mutual withdrawal. as a demand, that kind of falls away in the secret negotiations for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that at that point, there weren't that many North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam. So that's right. So because they're in Cambodia and they're in Laos and they're over the DMZ and in North Vietnam. But my main, so that for the US is not remain a focal point, or at least not for Kissinger. The issue for Kissinger is what Arnold did speak about, which is, are we going to remove the two government, right, from power on our way out? And that was a non-starter for many reasons. And it's on that particular point that the North Vietnamese negotiator, Le Duc Tho, changed positions on the question of removing two. And since Kissinger had been focused on this obsessively at the point that the North Vietnamese changed that one position, he announced this to himself and everybody else. So this is a great victory for us, which in fact, it really was. So I sort of want to put that in. But a larger question is like, why did this thing ever end, right? Why did the two sides actually, come to an agreement? And I want to really focus right now on the US side of that, because I think that there are certain underlying things that are really important. And one of them is that Nixon had no choice. And that's really interesting and important. Firstly, he had decided long before that he was not going to have his second administration tied up in the war, regardless of whatever Kissinger had to say at any given moment. He was done. He had made that clear. He would have been happy to be out before. And the question then is, why was that true? Right? Why did he want to get out? And there, I think, weirdly enough, you can get the answer from reading the memoirs of Kissinger and Nixon, which is the immense domestic pressure that had built in this country to get out and stop the war. And part of that, a very important part of the story that often gets forgotten, is the role of the peace movement, which is very, very significant when you look at the policy papers. And related to the peace movement is the role of Congress. And again, you can find these good news in their memoirs, even though no one believes any of it. But those pressures were very profound. And then there's an emotional fact, which is really hard to prove, but if you read a lot of these conversations, it's clear. Nixon was sick of the war. He felt like his first administration had been made miserable because of the war and the protests and so forth. So he really didn't want to be starting his second administration, in that way. He really wanted something, and so Kissinger knew that he had to make an end. But also important in this is Congress, because although people were focusing on the election in 1972, Nixon, was reelected by a landslide, more anti-war Congress people were also elected at the same time. And Goldwater and Ford and Stennis, his three best friends in this Congress, they come up to him like a week later and they said, look, there's no more money for this war, period. So Henry has to make a deal. And so I think all those things are important for us to keep in mind, even as we think of a lot of other more contemporary issues, that there really is a change in the administration, and it's a change that they did not eagerly embrace, but was caused by outside organization and pressure.
Well, let me ask you to consider another perspective. And we'll go to Carolyn first and then Arnold. And that is how does the Cold War figure in all of this? I mean, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, now about to be radically changed because of the changed relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. All that is in the mix while the peace talks are underway, both the public talks and the secret talks. So how did the management of the Cold War figure into the end of the Vietnam War? First Carolyn and then Arnold, please.
Right, and that, I mean, obviously there's a lot of things to look at there. One thing I would say that didn't figure is that honestly, I think when you look back at the record, concerns and fears about the Soviet Union and China, which was what, the way they had built consensus in this country, that we're worried about, these communist powers taking over the world. That's not relevant at all. It is not present. It is a bunch of rationalizations that are being given to the public. So I want to emphasize that. And I was actually shocked to the extent that that was true. But there's another point which I spent a lot of time in my book discussing, which will absolutely be very controversial, which is that when you look at the conversations that are going on, primarily between Kissinger and the Russians, and then Kissinger and the Chinese, and we now have, all those transcripts available, as well as the Russian notes. And what you see is exactly the opposite of what you would expect, which is that you would see that in actuality, that Kissinger is making major concessions to China and to Russia in order to get their help in getting out of Vietnam. And related to that, he's making those concessions because Nixon needs those trips as a way of building his image as a man of peace. So it was very surprising to me. I didn't go in with that preconception, but when you look at the record, what you see is Kissinger saying utterly ridiculous things in order to get them out of the Vietnam mess that they were in.
Arnold.
I don't disagree with anything that Carolyn has said. I don't disagree with her about her previous comment either. I mean, yes, we were equivocal about the North Vietnamese withdrawal for quite some time before October 72, but we had not outright said that those troops could remain, and that was the change that happened when we agreed to the final agreement. On the Cold War, my impression, and Carolyn knows much, much more about the state of mind of Nixon and Kissinger than I ever will, but my impression from everything that I remember from the time and from what I've read since is that when they came into office, they thought that was the route to settling Vietnam, that they could figure out that get the Chinese and the Russians to make Hanoi change its positions and settle the war. They did not appreciate that that happened before in Geneva. The Soviet Union pressed the North Vietnamese very hard to sign the Geneva Agreement, which then turned out to be a disaster from Hanoi's point of view. And the North Vietnamese were enormously distrustful. At the same time, they depended on China and the Soviet Union for arms and equipment and aid and financial aid, but they were very, very suspicious and very reluctant, very unwilling to take directions from their big allies. They played them off against each other quite successfully. But I think that Nixon and Kissinger thought that the road to peace in Vietnam was through Moscow and Beijing, and that didn't work out as they, at least certainly not as quickly as they hoped it would.
Carolyn, back to you, a follow-on question from me. And I want to make sure I'm not misinterpreting you. My sense of Nixon's self-image and Kissinger's self-image, each one thought that he was a master strategist, moving pieces on the chessboard of global politics. But what I hear you saying is that both of them really were focused primarily on domestic political concerns, and that domestic politics, in a sense, overrode strategic considerations. Did I hear that correctly, or?
Well, I think, yes, almost. Kissinger's concern was to stay in Nixon's good graces. I'm quite serious about that. For him, the important thing was, his role within the administration, his primacy in the administration, and a lot of the conduct that he engages in is really directed to doing whatever it is that he thinks is going to make Nixon happy. So, and Nixon, however, is much more concerned about the domestic situation. And one of the things you see in the record is a whole set of occasions on which Nixon, listening to Kissinger, reminds him over and over again about the public. No, Henry, you can't do that. We have to think about an election. Stop thinking about Chu's election. Think about my election. It's over and over. So, I would say definitely, but, really in some ways, obviously we've done research on the wars in Southeast Asia, the overwhelming and disturbing impression, is the immense destruction and suffering that was caused to people in those places and to our own soldiers. I mean, that's really the overwhelming sense that I think after years of research, I'm still left with that reality. But the other side of it is that reading the transcripts of those negotiations with the Russians and the Chinese was absolutely shocking, and at times even comical, to see the extent to which, especially Kissinger, but to a lesser degree Nixon, is just bending over on key issues in order to try to make sure that he has his visits and also that he gets some Russian help. And one item that I would just mention as an example of this is that there were many times when Kissinger was in these conversations that he did not use a US translator. Stunning fact. With certain conversations with the Russians and certain conversations with the Chinese. And that was very purposeful because minimally, he did not want the State Department to have any idea of what it is he was saying, and doing. So that's the, a remark. And Nixon himself in conversations in China also did things to make sure that nobody else in the government actually knew what was really being said there. So in many ways, I would say the real shock of my research was really looking at those conversations. They're just absurd. And then when you think about the fact that so many people are dying because they think the free world is in great danger, it's really kind of sickening to really wrap your brain around what's really going on there.
Let me shift to a different
I
topic.
may-
Oh, sorry, Arnold, go ahead, please.
If I may just put in one more thing about the Cold War, I think the other factor to remember is that was those issues, the relations with the Soviet Union and avoiding nuclear war and all that, maintaining nuclear deterrence and all that kind of thing, which China was a big part of because it was playing them off against the Soviet Union. That was uppermost in, I believe, or at least my sense was, in Nixon's and Kissinger's mind, much more important than any specific outcome in Vietnam. Vietnam was not the kind of war where you would get a sort of a clear cut, or where anybody expected a sort of a clear cut win or lose. It did end that way, but nobody thought it would until like a couple of weeks before it did, 10 years later or years later. So that they were not married to any particular outcome in South Vietnam. They wanted to maintain US credibility. They wanted the Russians and the Chinese to believe that we had this power, military power and diplomatic power that we could use effectively to counter their worldwide strategies. And that was, I don't know, Carolyn would know again better than I do, but I think that far outweighed who was sitting in the government buildings in Saigon and Hanoi.
I think that's probably our sharpest and most important disagreement. Because I really, and it wasn't a thing where I had these preconceptions when I went into these, files that, suddenly became open. Actually, when I started my project, they weren't open. You couldn't find out anything. I don't think that was true at all. I think it was really the reverse. I think that they wanted to have some kind of ending in Vietnam, which would avoid what, for example, just happened to Joe Biden when he took the troops out of Afghanistan, that it was going to be an immediate takeover by the communists, and the failure of American policy would become, very evident to everybody. They want to avoid that. And I think that's a far more important part. And I think part of what's really interesting about these very boring conversations about arms control, for example, is that, and on those, Nixon didn't care very much at all. He was so boring to him, to most normal people, Henry, just do whatever. But in actuality, when you look at those arms negotiations, what you see is Kissinger making concessions that actually turn out to put the US at an odd disadvantage, which, if I could fast forward to the decades later, actually the faulty way in which he negotiated the nuclear agreements actually provided fodder for a lot of right-wing people then who, began to whip up hysteria in the Reagan era about some nuclear disadvantage. But I think that's the real story, is that they were so cynical that that Nixon, for him looking good in Russia, having this wonderful visit to China, this is far, that's what they're going for.
But
And
hang on, Carolyn. Just let me interrupt for a second. Let us posit that you're right, that Nixon's principal motivation in all of this was to look good so that he could win re-election. And frankly, I'm not the expert you are, but I find that quite plausible. But how does it follow that prioritizing domestic considerations weighs that heavily in Kissinger's calculations? Kissinger, the strategist, and I acknowledge he's got to stay on the right side of Nixon, but do his priorities mirror Nixon's, or does he have distinctive priorities in dealing with things like ending the Vietnam War?
That's a very good question. I don't think that, I mean, obviously when he writes his books, he's always talking about the grand strategies
Right.
that he's, doing it. And of course, some of that rubs up, against, again, those transcripts where this grand strategy, becomes Kissinger saying, let's kick those sons of the bitches in the ass, right? So so much for, I mean, the crudeness actually of a lot of that conversation is also, very shocking. People were shocked when it came up with respect to Watergate, but it's actually even more appalling when you read it with respect to Asia. And I guess I would say that, again, the need to remain in power is very important. He disagreed with things that happened. And one of the things we haven't said here, which although Arnold alluded to it, is that this entire 4 years, the United States is withdrawing troops from Vietnam. It starts in the summer of '69, and it's going up so that by November, there are no combat troops left, which is another reason they made peace, because the US had no ground force anymore. Now, that policy of pulling out US troops was something that Kissinger was very opposed to. But on that particular point, Nixon followed the advice of Secretary of Defense, Melvin Laird. And that was one of my surprise sort of heroes when he went in the, I thought of him as just like everybody else. But what you see is that Laird, who had come out of the Congress, was very sensitive to pressures, domestic pressures. From the moment he becomes Secretary of Defense, one of his major priorities is to get the troops out. And in that particular respect, he is successful. And in that very crucial respect, Kissinger is very unsuccessful. And he knows from the beginning that it's going to handicap his ability to get a diplomatic agreement that he would like to have.
Let's shift to a specific episode that relates to the end game. And that's the U.S. bombing campaign, the so-called Christmas bombing. I think the Pentagon called it Linebacker 2. I think the Pentagon's perspective is, and I think Nixon also echoed some of this, that here finally we were going to be able to let loose. We weren't going to fight with one hand tied behind our back. We were going to bomb the hell out of the North Vietnamese. And that having done that, this is the Nixonian argument, that was key to now forcing the North Vietnamese to sign on to an agreement. There's a counter argument. The counter argument is that the whole Christmas bombing was actually an effort to get President Nguyen Van Thieu to sign on to an agreement that he correctly knew was going to signal the death knell of the Republic of Vietnam. But for both of you, Arnold, please, you first. What are your thoughts on how the Christmas bombing campaign fits into the last parts of the war?
As I said before, and this is overlooked, like on the Pentagon's 50th anniversary, they've had this 50th commemoration website up for a number of years now. You won't find this anywhere on that website. But in October, the US and North Vietnam had agreed on a final draft. And that draft became public at the time in October 1972. Then it got off the rails because of Thieu wouldn't sign it. Thieu having been excluded from these negotiations, they were not at the table. And then in January, after the bombing, the North Vietnamese signed and the U.S. signed this agreement in January. And that, of course, that text is available. And you can look at them in black and white, and they're the same. The North Vietnamese didn't agree to anything in January that they had not already agreed to in October. So to argue that the bombing made them do something that they otherwise wouldn't have done seems logically and in my opinion, conclusively disproved by that.
If I could come in on this for a minute, I think this is a place where we probably both agree about the Christmas bombing. And I would even, add further that Nixon was doing it with the full knowledge that he was going to end the war come January 3rd. So there's a lot of cynicism involved. But I actually wanted to say something about the military, because another thing that I found very shocking when I looked into it was the Air Force didn't want to do this. And Secretary of the Air Force, as well as Secretary Laird, were saying, please don't do this. Why were they saying? Number one, because they knew perfectly well the war was ending. Number two, because between the time of the spring offensive and December, the North Vietnamese anti-aircraft ability to shoot planes down had been vastly improved. I actually interviewed a general in South Vietnam who was working on that particular project. How can we shoot American planes down? He was an old man. He was still happy thinking about it. But the Air Force knew that, and Laird knew it. And Laird's point was, why are we going to send these planes up? For every 100 planes that goes up, 3 of them are going to get shot down and Americans are going to be killed. And for what reason are we going to sacrifice those people?
Well, please answer that question. In other words, if everybody knew that the war was ending, then why did the Christmas bombing happen?
Well, in the case of the military, I would say specifically in the case of the Air Force and the case of Secretary of Defense, it happened over their strenuous objections. So this was not something that had any consensus, didn't have agreement from the State Department either. This was really Nixon and Kissinger. And I think there's a couple of reasons for it. And then there's one that is, is truly speculative, right? But you have to understand the enraged state of mind that both of them are in at this point. By the time you're getting to December, primarily, as Arnold has pointed out, the South Vietnamese are absolutely refusing to sign this agreement. And they're in a rage. And, Kissinger tried to satisfy them in a variety of ways, and nothing was working. And in fact, to one day before that agreement was signed, the South Vietnamese government was resisting. So that's really a major part of the decision to say, okay, this is the last thing we're going to do to try to persuade Thieu to accept this agreement. So that's part of it. The other thing is that what is true is that the North Vietnamese had not left the negotiations, but Le Duc Tho had gone home. And what is true is that the North Vietnamese have become more stubborn and problematic than they had been before because of Thieu. And so there was a delay.
What do you mean because of Thieu? Explain that.
Because since Thieu had turned down the October agreement that Arnold is talking about, Kissinger then, to pacify them, had spent weeks trying to negotiate 69 changes to an agreement that he had promised not to change. And so in the face of that, the North Vietnamese get to become, troublesome also. They're going to give him a hard time. So, they're not signing at the minute that he wants them to, but he is absolutely 100% sure that this is all shadow boxing and that they will sign. He knows that. But
he knows who's going to sign.
He knows the North Vietnamese. Thank you for asking it, because, if you're in this world, you get very unclear about things. He knows North Vietnam is going to sign that agreement. He has absolutely no doubt about whatsoever. But he's annoyed with Le Duc Tho and frustrated about how the conversations are going. Again, not as annoyed as he is with North Vietnam. But I think there's also this emotional element, which I can't prove, and I don't know if any historian can prove it, which is, again, the level of frustration that both Kissinger and Nixon feel about being in the situation that they find themselves in December of 1972. And this is something that crops up periodically. They want to punish the enemy. And they want to do as much damage to the enemy on their way out as is possible to do. And that is, when you read those discussions that are going on, that anger and that desire to really be destructive is very, very palpable, which is why, in Hanoi, there's, many, many civilians that are killed as they crush houses in the middle of downtown Hanoi, and hospital is blown up and so forth. We think about Putin, right? We look every day, oh my God, how could he do this? But, go back and look at what happened in Hanoi at that time. So I'm not giving you a single answer. I think it's a combination of factors, but that idea of doing a lot of destruction on your way out is something that they flirted with for a very long time.
If I could have one more
Sure.
one thought to that. I haven't seen this mentioned anywhere in any of the exchanges I've happened to come across about this anniversary, but they were trying to do damage. This is, I agree that what makes sense, the only logical explanation is that the bombing was to change. Chu was the only one who changed policy as a result of the bombing. And they wanted to leave him make him feel that he was in the best military position he could possibly be. And at the same time as the bombing, the agreement, the draft agreement in October, and this was true again in January, specifically banned the import of sending new weapons and supplies and military aid from outside Vietnam to the parties. That is, the Russians and the Chinese were supposed to stop and aiding North Vietnam, and we were supposed to stop shipping weapons to South Vietnam. So that clause was in the October draft, but of course that draft wasn't signed. And the Americans followed with Operation Enhance Plus. Mm-hmm. We'd already been stepped up arms shipments to South Vietnam to meet the offensive, the spring 1972 offensive. But after October, we started Enhance Plus, and they sent tons and tons and shiploads of all kinds of weapons, ammunition, and supplies, dwarfing, as I understand, any other shipments in a similar period of time. And all that was to put Chu in the strongest position that he could be in, to make him more confident that he could withstand, that he could fight on after the American troops left. And I think the bombing was aimed really at, and the whole strategy of the United States was aimed at Chu.
Next question.
I should add that a lot of that stuff was still in crates 2.5 years later when the North Vietnamese marched into Saigon. There was a lot of this stuff that the South Vietnamese had they couldn't operate them. They couldn't maintain them. They didn't know how to use them. We had, I forget how many now, but it was 10 or 12,000 contractors who did go after the American troops were gone. There were all these contractors who had to maintain these planes and armored vehicles and that kind of stuff. And the North and the South Vietnamese really never did use a lot of that shipment.
So I think my next question, I'm sorry, Carolyn, go ahead.
Let me just sort of add to this. I think implicit in what we're saying, but we're not quite saying it, is that this peace agreement was not a peace agreement. What it was a way for the United States to get its troops home and to get its prisoners back. But there was never any question but that the fighting was going to continue. The only issue was, would the fighting start in 2 weeks, or as Arnold would say, the next day, or was it going to, be a suspension for 2 months and then it would go on. But this was a fake agreement in every respect, except for the respect that the United States was pulling its people, out of the situation. And I think, and I don't know if others would agree, I think really this peace agreement was not only a fake, but it also signified American failure. That the question was not, would you have peace? There wasn't going to be peace. And if you really ask Kissinger and Nixon, who do you think is going to win at the end of the day, now that you guys have left, even with all your weapons? I think both of them would have said North Vietnam. That this is really a profound American failure. And I think even to this day, we fail to appreciate the enormity of that failure and the responsibility that our country has because we're talking about a project that caused the death of 58,000 Americans and millions of Asians and unbelievable suffering that continues to this day. And this is an agreement and a settlement that is really a fraud.
I think I disagree with you, Carolyn, in this sense, that if we could have asked them and gotten an honest answer, who's going to win, I think Nixon and Kissinger would have said, I don't care. I mean, they were washing their hands of this entire tragic, criminal, painful chapter in our history and in the history of the people of Southeast Asia. And they were determined to walk away from it, which really gets to my next question. I think maybe it answers itself. I mean, there is a point of view that Nixon and Kissinger, and more broadly the United States, that we abandoned and betrayed the Republic of Vietnam. Not just President Thieu, but that all those who had been our partners in this enterprise, that we betrayed them. What do you think of that charge?
Arnold, do you want to?
Arnold?
Well, those are sort of loaded words. I mean, if you say that abandoning South Vietnam was betraying South Vietnam, then the premise there is that the right thing to do was not to abandon them, was not to walk out of the war. Taking out 500,000 troops was a much more significant act if you just use the word abandoned. Taking out 500,000 US soldiers, troops, was abandoning South Vietnam, much colossally more than anything in the peace agreement. If that abandonment was necessary for bigger purposes, or because we weren't winning the war, because then I think that's the factor that drove all this policy, was that it wasn't succeeding. That was certainly an abandonment. I don't think there's any other word that can describe it. Betrayal sort of implies that that was the wrong thing to do, and that would mean that pulling out all those troops was the wrong thing to do, because that was the real act of abandonment.
And your judgment is what with regard to withdrawal, disengagement, letting events follow their course? Your view, your judgment.
Well, I'm not my guess is, and this is purely a guess, and Carolyn would know much more again about the record of what they said to each other and what they put on paper. My sense has always been that like on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, they thought, well, that's it. There's no way that South Vietnam can survive without the U.S. helping them fight the war, and so sooner or later they're going to go down. And on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I thought, well, maybe there's a chance. Maybe if we give them enough money and enough aid, they can survive. And let me add one other thing. Thieu's strategy and his sort of overall wartime strategy did not change 1 ounce after the agreement. His policy was to defend every square foot of territory where he could put some troops. After the agreement, after the Americans were gone, he tried to hang on to every last outpost they had, including lots of them that had to be supplied by air, which is very expensive. And they expended tons and tons and tons of ammunition and many casualties in holding on to positions that they had no hope of holding against another major offensive. And they wasted, if they had changed their strategy to a feasible strategy in light of the fewer resources that they now had, I think they could still be sitting there. And I'm not aware that the U.S., I never found a shred of evidence that the Americans ever tried to get to rein in any of his offensive operations, that they tried to get him ever to sort of cut back on what he was going to try to defend. There's a couple of very fleeting and tiny little examples where they pulled out a few outposts, but basically they did.
Let me press you on that just a little bit. So when the peace accords are signed, there's something in the order of 140,000 North Vietnamese troops occupying South Vietnam, portions of South Vietnam. Something on the order of 20% of South Vietnam is occupied by under the control of the North Vietnamese. You're suggesting that had Tew been wiser and pursued really a defensive strategy, hold on to what he already controlled, that you think potentially that would have been, he could have succeeded, that the Republic of Vietnam could have survived?
They certainly would have been in a lot better position when the next offensive began at the end of 1974, if he hadn't used all those resources to defend positions that were not defendable against a major offensive. Mm-hmm. And that was not, that was not, that was something you could see. I could see that on the ground when I was there in 1974 and 1975. And that they were crazy. And there were people who did say, you have to start pulling back, figure out what you can defend with these fewer diminished resources and what you can't defend. And instead of losing troops and ammo defending those places that you're going to lose anyway, pull out of them now before you lose them. And that was, as I say, that was fairly obvious.
So I think, there's a...
To finish up, whether that would have, in the end, they would have survived with that, I don't know. But I think they would have had a much better chance than they did in the circumstances as they actually happened.
Can I just swing us back for a moment to Betrayal?
You bet.
Whatever. Because Arnold was there and could see how that army was functioning. But I want to just go back for a minute to Betrayal. Which obviously is something people started talking about like immediately, just like they're talking about, Afghanistan as a betrayal. And so what is clear, if you're going to use that term, which I think is a pejorative term, obviously, is that what was true is that what Nixon and Kissinger did was disappointing to the government of South Vietnam, and they felt betrayed. That did the United States have a responsibility to keep supplying them with weapons forever, or to keep sending our people there to fight? And was that an obligation we had undertaken? I don't think so. But obviously for the government of South Vietnam, was a big problem. And what's interesting is that the South Vietnamese government itself, and Q would be just the top of that, they felt pretty strongly that their ability to function on their own without the United States was not very promising at all. I mean, part of their extreme upset about this agreement was that the Americans were leaving with all those North Vietnamese troops and this stuff, and they did not have any confidence that they would be able to deal effectively. And I think I have a minor nitpick with Arnold on what did they think, what day, about what did Kissinger and Nixon think that day about the skill of the South Vietnamese army. I think there's a little bit of a sea change that happens. I think early on that they really aren't clear about if we take our troops out, can they fight effectively?
When you say early on is when?
Early on in the Nixon administration, I think it was an open question. If we start taking our troops out, can South Vietnamese soldiers, if we build them up, actually carry the burden of that? But I believe that really by the spring of 1971, after a failed expedition in Laos, that basically both Nixon and Kissinger recognized that South Vietnamese army is not competent and is not going to be able to handle things on their own. And it's interesting because at that point, Nixon begins to toy with the idea of ending the war right there. And Kissinger tells him, no, it's too dangerous to do that. But when we think about betrayal, I think there's the other side of betrayal. What about the South Vietnamese people? What about the people we haven't mentioned that obviously Arnold's written a lot about in Cambodia? What was the impact on people who lived in these places of what the US military was doing on the ground? Not to mention the betrayal of our own troops. And, I was saying this just, before apropos of the Christmas bombing, but the Christmas bombing is just a grotesque example of what had been happening for years, right? That we're going to send planes up to do and knowing that there are Americans that would be killed. There are even going to be more Americans taken prisoner, which is absolutely idiotic. You're actually going to do that knowing that the war is going to end. To me, that's the meaning of betrayal. Betrayal of our own people, betrayal of people who live in other countries.
I want to go back to, you just mentioned in passing that Nixon had toyed with the idea of ending the war sooner. Unilaterally, we quit, we're leaving.
He toyed with the idea of pulling back more U.S. because if we go to 71, of getting, it wasn't so much about the peace agreement, which he was always a little confused by, but he was thinking about getting American troops out of
accelerating the rate of withdrawal.
Right, so that you would get all the combat troops out very quickly. He did toy with that.
And Kissinger opposed that line of thought.
Opposed it. And I think we even see that, we have records of that, because basically what Kissinger says, so again, he's thinking time, 1971 spring, is Kissinger saying, if you do that, South Vietnam could fall before the election in November. That's not a safe thing to do. And undoubtedly had support on that from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other parts. Because that was the fear, right? That there would be that what would happen to Nixon is what happened to Johnson, right? Which is what hangs over this whole thing, right? That here's Johnson, looks like he's going to be reelected, right. And then you get the Tet Offensive. And hanging this whole situation is, would this happen to Nixon as well? Could there be an offensive in 1972 that would be as disastrous for him as Tet had been for Lyndon Johnson?
We're going to run short of time here. I'm sorry, Arnold, go ahead.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Well, I got one more question. I'm not sure we're going to get to the audience, and because I want to spend the time we have remaining to shift to the question of Ukraine. And the question basically is, are there any lessons from the Vietnam peacemaking experience that can have application to the current situation with Russia and Ukraine? I must admit, I'm in the camp that believes that the United States has paid too little attention. A lot of attention given to escalation, a lot of attention given to providing weaponry and other support to Ukraine. It doesn't seem to me there's a lot of attention given to how can this conflict be brought to an end. I wonder if either of you have thoughts about lessons from the Vietnam experience that could potentially have application to the situation today.
Shall I?
Go ahead, Arnold.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the two situations are so vastly different, and the world is so vastly different that in general, I think there aren't very many valid comparisons to be made between Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and the war in 2023 and the war in Vietnam in 1973. But the one thought that I did have when I saw your question was, it reminded me of the truism that I forget who was, if anybody is actually credited with this, that you can't get in negotiations what you didn't win on the battlefield. It was never conceivable that any agreement in Vietnam was going to result in the North Vietnamese withdrawing their troops. That was just not an attainable objective, and we didn't attain it. And the consequences of that were the consequences. And I'm wondering, again, I don't speak with anything like the same knowledge about Ukraine, but I do kind of wonder whether there is an analogy with Crimea, whether getting Crimea back is something that they're really not in a position to do, and if they're not in a position to do it on the battlefield, then can anybody reasonably expect that they can do that in negotiations? And if it's not possible, then somewhere along the line, the peacemaking process is going to have to recognize that. So that's the one factor, the one sort of analogy that I guess I would think might occur.
Well, if I could just come in on that, no, Andy, I agree. I mean, I think one of the shocking things about the situation in Ukraine is the obvious or apparent lack of interest by the U.S. In getting a negotiation going. And that's been manifest for probably at least a year. And the whole atmosphere in Washington is, very whipped up behind this military adventure, and let it go forward, and let's not interfere with it, and so forth. So I mean, I think it's a terrible tragedy that's happening. I agree with Arnold that these are very different situations. However, in terms of relevance, it seems to me that what's important is not just to look at what's happening in Ukraine now, but how did we get to this place? Right? And I think when we ask that question, and we look at US policy in the aftermath of the Cold War and the implosion of the Soviet Union, opportunity to really, create a more powerful, peaceful structures that would give security to everybody. What did the US do? The US took that opportunity to actually strengthen its military position in Europe, right? By expanding NATO first to Warsaw Pact countries, then the republics from the Soviet Union. In that particular way, not to mention the whole series of military ventures that the United States undertakes after the Cold War is over. So you have to look at those policies as things that really produced or helped to produce the crisis that we have now. And I know that when people hear that, a lot of folks say, oh, well, this is just, you're just rationalizing Putin. You're saying what Putin is doing is okay. I'm not saying that. I think what Putin is doing is horrifying. I think it's critically important to stop him. But what we never took account of in the aftermath of the Vietnam War was the militaristic nature of our executive, the power of those national security bureaucracies, propelling this country into military adventures and quest for military superiority that never got addressed. And with the collapse of Russia, it reasserted itself. And it's reasserting itself now, that military complex had become cheerleaders for the Russians, not a source of peace, but a source of continued war. So I think that there's that connection, but it's truly hard to say that in 60 seconds.
Well, you did a nice job. We are at the end of our allotted hour. On behalf of all the folks who are listening in, I want to thank you both for taking the time to speak with us. I want to mention again, we got an updated edition of Arnold's Without Honor. It has just been published. And I want to mention especially Carolyn's new book, Fire and Rain, available, really a spectacular success that ought to be widely read. I've been asked to make two concluding announcements on behalf of the Quincy Institute. This is in relation to two events that are about to come up. The first is at noon on January 30th, a webinar subject, Blinken's trip to Beijing, U.S.-China relations at a crossroads. And we'll have a distinguished set of panelists, Kendra Schaefer, Michael Swain, Michael Davidson, to discuss that topic. A day later, January 31st at 10 a.m., a panel on what Pakistan's climate crisis means for the world. And joining QI for that event will be Pakistan's ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Masood Khan, and the director of the USAID Office of Climate and Sustainability Growth at the embassy in Islamabad. So as many of you as possible, we hope you'll be able to find time to join us for that. In the meantime, again, one more time, our thanks to Arnold and to Caroline for this, I think, very stimulating discussion about an event that I know I continue to think a lot about. So thank you very much and good afternoon.